Lovely, thanks for that. Okay, well, I think we'll make a start because yeah, we're just about at 6 o'clock now. So thank you everyone for joining this evening's session on principles of costing for level two. My name's Ben Campbell. I'm a level two and three tutor here at Training Link, and we've been running these sessions for a few weeks now. We're going to be doing these up until about August, I think. We're going to do a level two and a level three one every month. Just going through some of the topics that we can expect to see in the exam, what tends to come up in the mock exams as well. They are free sessions and they are an hour long, so we won't necessarily be going through everything that appears in the exam. But from my experience, I've picked out a few of the key topics that I think are worth covering in these sessions. So let's make a start. I'll share my screen with you. Perfect, excellent. Um, so what I've done today, picked out some topics that we're going to look at from this unit, things that tend to come up quite often when I'm dealing with queries. First of all, we're going to look at inventory valuation. So that's going to be our FIFO, LIFO, and AVCO. We're going to then look at some labour costing, paying specific attention to the difference between overtime and overtime premium, because that's something that tends to come up quite a bit. And then finally, we'll kind of wrap that up and look at overhead and absorption costing and kind of look into a bit more detail about what that actually means and some of the questions that we can expect to see in the exam. Okay, so first of all, we are going to start on a FIFO question. Okay, and what I've done for each of these three methods, okay, I've got the inventory card for FIFO, LIFO, AVCO, and we're going to use the same scenario. So it's the same quantity, the same total cost for the receipts and the dates, etc. But we're going to use that information differently based on how we evaluate our inventory. And then at the end, we'll kind of do a comparison between the three so we can see exactly what that means. So I wanted to keep the information the same rather than change that so we can see that direct comparison. And generally speaking, this is what you'll see. You'll often have no more than two issues at max. Okay, you'll kind of have a period in which this case we're looking at the month of January, and in there we've got receipts, which are any purchases of inventory that have come into production. We then have issues which are issued from a warehouse, for example, that go into that production process to make the final product. And then we kind of have a running balance that forms as we receive more receipts. So that increases this balance. And then when we issue them, that decreases the balance. And that kind of forms part of our inventory valuation there. So generally, the first one that you start with will be a balance at the start of the period. So we're starting January this year. We've got 10,000 kilograms and it cost us £50,000. Okay. Then a week later, on the 8th of January, we purchased a further 8,000 kilograms, and this came at a total cost of 40,800. And what we are going to do as we go through is kind of update these fields as we go in the receipts column, because sometimes you can be asked to do that in an exam. And the way we would do that is we'd take our total cost, in this case 40,800, and divide it by the quantity, which is 8,000 kilograms, to get a cost per kilogram, which should be £5.10. Okay. Then we get to the 11th of January in this case, and we've got our first issue, and this is for 11,000 kilograms. And depending on the method that we're working with, depends on how we work out the cost of this issue and how this affects our balance. Okay, so just before actually we get on to that, we'll add our receipt here into the balance column. So 8,000 onto the 10,000 brings us up to 18,000, and that came at a cost of 50,000 plus 40,800, so that should give us 90,800. Okay. So then the issue. So what we're looking at here, we'll refer to this as issue one. Okay. Using first in, first out, which is FIFO, we're going to use the earlier of the stock first, and then work our way down the inventory record card. So where we've got this 11,000 here, we're going to use the full 10,000 from the opening balance, okay? And then we need to use 1,000 from here, okay? So 10,000 kilograms from the 1st of Jan, and then 1,000 from the 8th. And when we work out what that is as a cost, we could take the full cost here of £50,000 for the 10,000. We know that the cost per kilogram is £5.10. So if we do £5.10 times 1,000 plus the 50,000 total cost, that should give us a total cost there of 55,100. Okay. Then at this point, we work out the cost per kilogram. So the first thing we do here is work out the total cost. And then we work out the cost per kilogram for the issue by taking the total cost divided by the quantity of the issue. So if we do 55,100 divided by 11,000, we should get 5.01. And that kind of makes sense when we look at this, because if we looking at a unit cost here per kilogram for the opening balance, if we do 50,000 divided by 10,000, you get £5 per kilogram. That increased to £5.10 per kilogram a week later, and generally prices will always increase. So the fact that we're using 10,000 from here and then 1,000 from there, the 8th, which is a slightly higher price, kind of aligns with having a slightly higher cost per kilogram compared to this balance, which it is mostly made up from. Okay. Everyone okay with that so far at this point? Does that make sense of how we've got to here? Has anyone got any questions so far? All good. Okay, perfect. So then we update our balance column as well. So we had 18,000. We've just issued 11,000. So that means we've got 7,000 kilograms left. And we had a total cost of 90,800. We've just issued 55,100. So we need to deduct that. And that will give us 35,700. So at this point in time, what we're saying is that we currently have 7,000 kilograms, which is worth 35,700. We then have our next receipt on the 15th of January for 9,000 kilograms at a cost of £5.20. So if we multiply them together, we get a total cost for that order of 46,800. Okay, which is just these two multiplied together. Going to update the balance column as well. So we've just gained 9,000 onto our 7,000. So that's going to take us to 16,000. And if we add the cost of 46,800 onto our existing total cost, that should give us 82,500. Okay, we've then got another receipt here of 5,000 a week later. Okay, missing the cost per kilogram there. So total cost divided by quantity should give us £5.25 per kilogram for this particular receipt. And then again, we can add those onto there as we go on our running balance. Okay. That then brings us to our final receipt here for 15,000. Okay, and remember, using FIFO, we're going from the earliest stock first. So it's always important to remember at this point what you've already used. And this is something which comes up when you've got multiple issues, where sometimes you can almost forget that you've already used this 10,000 here for this 11,000 issue. Okay, and we've used 1,000 of this 8,000 here because that was for 11,000. So when we look at issue 2 here, okay, we're going to take the remaining 7,000 kilograms from the 8th of the 1st because we're carrying on working down. Okay, so we're taking the remaining 7,000 from here. That means that we have 8,000 remaining, 8,000 kilograms remaining, which we can take directly from this receipt on the 15th, where there's 9,000 there. Okay. So with FIFO, we're just working our way down. We've used the full amount there, and we've used 8,000 from this 9,000 here. Okay. So if we add those together, if we were doing that in a sum, we've got £5.10 times 7,000 plus £5.20 for these ones times 8,000, which should give us a total cost issue here of 77,300. Okay, and then once we've got this figure here, divide it by the quantity of 15,000 to get a cost per kilogram, which should give us £5.15. Okay, and then as we've done at every single point here on each row, we update the balance as we go. So we had 21,000, we've just issued 15,000, so we've got 6,000 left. That 21,000 was valued at £108,750. The total cost of what we just issued is 77,300. So what's left is 31,450, which is the valuation for the 6,000 we have remaining. Okay. So just remember what you've used, and that makes sure that when you've got these multiple issues, you're just kind of like remembering, you know, where you've kind of taken these figures from. Does anyone got any questions on the FIFO method there? Does that make sense how we've done that? All good. Yeah, yeah, brilliant. Excellent. Excellent. So with LIFO, we are basically following the same process, but we're doing this in the reverse order. Okay. So rather than populating these entries here, I've left those in from before because they're exactly the same to what we calculated here on the receipt side. So we don't need to do anything with those. We're just looking at the issues here. Okay. So this time when we get to LIFO and we've got this 11,000 kilogram issue, we're going to take that from the latest stock and then work our way up the record card. So we're always doing this from kind of the point of where we're at. So if we were looking at issue 1 this time, we would take the full 8,000 kilograms from the 8th of the 1st, and then we'd take 3,000 from the 1st of the 1st. Okay, so we're using this full amount here, that 8,000 is gone, and then we're going to use 1,000 from there, 3,000 from there, sorry. Okay, so that would be a cost of 40,800 taken from here, plus, and then if you were doing this, you'd do 50,000 divided by 10,000 times, and then the 3,000 that you want. Okay. And if you add those together, you'll get a total cost of 55,800. Alternatively, if you did want to kind of make a separate note about what the unit cost of these are in advance, that's absolutely fine if it helps you do that, whatever method works best for you. And then again, same process, we take the total cost divided by the quantity of the issue to get a cost per kilogram, which in this case is £5.07. If you're ever in a situation with rounding, you just round to the nearest penny unless told otherwise in the question. Okay. We can then update our balance column by deducting the quantity and the total cost from here. again, and then we'd add these on again. So we had 7,000. We've just got a receipt for 9,000. So that takes us to 16,000. The cost was 35,000 at this point. We've got the 46,800. So if we add those together, we should get 81,800 as a valuation for our 16,000 kilograms. Same again here, another 5,000 kilograms purchase. So that takes us to 21,000. And that came at a cost of 26,250. So add that onto our existing total cost, which should give us 108,050. Then we come to this final issue for 15,000. So issue 2 is going to be taking the full 5,000 from the 22nd. Remember, with LiFo, we're working our way up from the latest stock. So at this point, we're moving up to the 22nd there. We're going to take 9,000 kilograms from the 15th. And then that leaves us with 1,000 kilograms left, which we're going to take from the 8th of the 1st. Okay, so using all of these, that's 14,000 there. Still need 1,000 to make up our 15. So we're going to take 1,000 from here. We're going to take 1,000 from here. Sorry, the total, the balance, because if you remember, we already used the full amount there from issue 1. Okay, so really important to remember what you've already used. I myself there nearly fell into the trap. We've already used all of that, so we're taking 1,000 from here instead. Okay, so that would be 26,250, because we're going to use all of that, plus 46,800, as we're going to use all of that as well. And then 1,000 at £5 is going to be 5,000, which should give us a cost of issue of 78,050. Okay. Change that to the 1st of the 1st because I mistyped that there. So yeah, from the 1st of the 1st there. Okay. Then we can do exactly what we've done up to this point. Reduce the balance for the issue, which should give us 108,050 minus 78,050 gives us a final amount of 30,000. Okay. Any questions on that part? Does that make sense there? All good. Excellent. Good stuff. Good stuff. Brilliant. And that kind of brings us on to the last one, which is Avco. So again, we're still using the same data here. Never worked with 2 issues before, so it's been valuable. Yeah, so a lot of the times it is 1, but sometimes you can have 2 as well. So always good to kind of see it in the inventory card and where those come from, just to kind of avoid that duplication. With Avco, what we do differently is we work out an average cost on the most recent balance when we get to the point of issue. So we don't need to do anything by working out what the average cost is every time there's a receipt or every time we look at the balance. We literally just take it up to the point of issue and then we use that. So if we were using issue 1 here, we're basically going to work out what the average cost per kilogram is based on what we've already got, and then multiply it by the quantity. So issue 1 would be, we'd take the 90,800, divide it by 18,000 kilograms, multiplied by 11,000 kilograms, which should give us a not very nice number, which we then round up. Okay, so that would give us 55,489. Just usually what happens with Avco and generally with the other ones as well, you usually end up rounding the total cost to the nearest whole number rather than putting in the pence. But if you're given any other instructions on how to show those figures, then you'll be given that in the scenario. This case, we're just going to round these to the nearest whole number. And what I would say, really important note at this point, because this is how you're going to get tested in the exam, is don't work out this figure here and then round at this point, okay? Because if you end up working out an average cost per, in this case, kilogram, and then you round at that point and then multiply by the issue, what you'll find is you'll probably be like a couple of pounds out based on the numbers being quite large. So the way you test it is you don't round in the middle, you round at the end. So best thing to do, divide by the quantity of what you've got. Keep that number in your calculator because it's likely to be a long decimal number. Multiply that by the issue and then round at this final point here. Then when it comes to working out the cost per kilogram, do exactly the same as what we've done with the other ones. We take this rounded total cost and divide it by the quantity, and then that will give us our cost per kilogram. Okay, so really important note on the round in there. And then, as we've done in every other case, we update the balance as we go. This figure's been different every time that we've done this first issue, which is why we're doing this balance every single time, even though the quantity will still be the same. It's the total cost which is changing each time. Okay, so adding those together, 16,000, and we've got another 5,000 there, so that takes us to 21 again. Add the total cost for that amount onto what we've already got. It should give us 108,661. And then finally, same process at this point here when we come to working out this cost of issue. Okay, we'll go by the recent balance. So 108,361 divided by 21,000 kilograms times by 15,000 kilograms will give us 77,400.714 rounded up. Okay, so 77,401. And then take that figure, divide it by the quantity to get the unit cost, which should be £5.16 rounded there. And then we can finally update our balance. So with Avco, it's just you just have to go by the latest balance when you come to each point of issue and just look out for the round in there and make sure you round the final total cost at the end and not the per, in this case, kilogram or whatever it is that you're dealing with in another question. Everyone okay with that one? Yeah, good stuff. And what that means, if we were going to kind of like analyze, the purpose of why we're doing that, because sometimes that is a big thing. We look at things and it's like, well, what's the point of this? Like, why are we doing it? If we compare all of these side by side and we look at each method, generally speaking, what happens is the costs tend to increase over time, and that's the general assumption unless you're told otherwise. So when we're using the FIFO method, okay, and we're looking at this is just the issues and the sorry, I've just taken these two columns. So this is just the issues and the balance for each one. I've not included the receipts just so I can get it on screen. With FIFO, generally what you find is your cost of issue is less as opposed to LIFO. And the reason for that being is because you're issuing the earliest stock, which is cheaper. So the cost of what you're issuing is cheaper. But on the flip side of that, what that means is that what you're left with is higher because you've got the more valuable stock, not more valuable, but the higher cost stock left in storage. Okay, so when you compare FIFO and AVCO, for example, cost per issue is always going to be less with FIFO, but what you're left with is always going to be higher with FIFO compared to LIFO. And with AVCO, because you're using an average, it should always kind of sit in the middle. Okay, it's not going to be exactly in the middle. It's not necessarily going to be, right down the middle. Like in this case, 515 for the issue, it's 516 on AVCO and 521 on LIFO. It's not necessarily going to be bang on the middle, but it will be somewhere in between. So it's always like a helpful little check if ever you comparing multiple methods, just to like make that comparison. Because if you kind of find that some of these figures are falling out of this pattern, then something's probably gone wrong along the way. Okay, but it isn't until level 3 where you actually have to analyze this, but I just kind of wanted to show you a little bit of why that is, just with the hope that it kind of makes a bit of sense as to the purpose of why we're doing it. Okay, so everyone's okay with that. We're going to look at labour costing next, and specifically overtime versus premium. This is definitely one of those that I see very frequently with how we calculate these figures. And sometimes in the questions, you don't really get a clear, almost like instruction of which one you're working with. It tends to come with spotting the detail in what's given to you. So in this example, we've got JR Limited pays its employees £20 per hour for a standard 40-hour week. Any hours worked more than this are paid at time and a half, and we need to calculate the gross wages for each of the staff members below. Okay, so if we're looking at this, and I've got this same question type twice, okay, the only difference with this is that the heading of this column is overtime premium, and the heading of this one is overtime. And what we enter in here is going to be completely different based on that. And sometimes in an exam, I've definitely seen it in the mocks, that is the only difference. So it's very important to recognize when they're asking you for overtime premium or overtime amount, because the overtime premium is the overtime rate only. So if we're looking at this one, okay, and we've got time and a half, okay, and £20 is the basic pay. Half of that is £10. So that is the overtime premium. Okay. If it said overtime only, then it would be £30 because you'd add these together. Okay. So because we're asked for the overtime premium only, we're only including the £10 based on these extra hours. Okay. So for A Burns, we've got 38 hours worked and we get basic pay is £20 per hour. So if we multiply those together, we'll get £760. The standard week is 40 hours. So A Adams has worked 38, so they're not entitled to any overtime there. So that will be zero, meaning the gross wage will be 760. With B Burns, what we've got are 41 hours worked, okay? And because we've got an overtime premium here, okay, what we're going to do is 41 times 20, which should give us £820 for the basic pay. So we're doing the full 41 hours basic pay in this column, okay? And the reason for that is because in this premium one, we're only capturing the half rate. Okay, so the time and a half being that £10. So 1 hour worked over there. Okay, so that'll be £10 on the overtime premium. So if we add 820 plus 10, we should get 830 gross wage. Same applies to C Clover, this time 44 basic hours worked, so times that by 20 should give us 880. There's 4 hours extra worked there, so 4 times 10 is our £40 on the overtime premium. So that gives us a gross wage of £920. This one, 40 times 20 gives us 800. No overtime hours worked there, so we'll put that as 0, which means the gross wage is £800. And then finally, ENS 42 times 20 should give us 840. And then because we've got 2 hours worked over at this £10 premium, that should give us £20 there. Okay, which gives us £860 as the gross wage. So if ever you ask for overtime premium, the full amount of basic hours goes into the basic pay column, with only this overtime rate only being the £10 here, because it's half of the 20, time and a half, to get our gross wage. Obviously, if you do this the other way round, you lose a big chunk of marks here. Your gross wage is probably still going to be the same as long as your calculations are all right. So you'll pick up marks there, but you will lose a big chunk on these first 2 columns. Does that make sense as to how we've done that? Yeah. Excellent. Okay. Okay, yes. Very fair. Because what we're going to do this time, on the next one, I'll copy that there. We're going to do exactly the same, this time using overtime only. So we're going to be using the overtime rate, okay, of £30 there. Okay. So for basic pay on this one, 38 hours worked. So that's exactly the same. 38 times 20 equals 760. No overtime, meaning the gross wage is 760. Now this time, what we're going to do when we're looking at overtime only is we're only accounting for the standard 40 hours. So we'll do 40 times 20 equals 800. And that's because in this overtime, we're capturing this extra basic pay hour in the overtime column, because we're using the £30 time and a half overtime rate. So because there's only 1 hour worked over there, we're going to put £30 there as well, which gives us 830. Exactly the same below. 44 hours have been worked, but we're only recording the 40 basic there for the standard. We've got 4 hours worked at 30 times at £30 an hour. So that gives us 120, which gives us our gross wage of 920. Exactly the same again there. We're using the 40 hours. There's no overtime, so nothing to do there. So that's 800. And then finally, same again, extra 2 hours that are the basic pay. This time the basic pay goes in this overtime column because we're using the £30. So that gives us £60 in there. 2 times 30. And then add those together, 860. So if we actually compare the two, flicking between the sides, the gross wage is exactly the same on both. Okay, there's no difference between that gross wage. It's exactly the same. What's different is where we're almost splitting these rates here and how they appear. And again, in an exam, it literally is. It really can just be the one word of saying overtime or overtime premium. So really do pay attention and look out for that key detail in there. Has anyone got any questions on what we've done there? Does that make sense how we've kind of worked out the 2 different methods there? No, you don't necessarily need to show the working out. I've done it on screen just so it's there, and I didn't do it on the overtime, but again, I could have done that as well. You don't necessarily have to in the exam. It'll just be typing in the figure there. But yeah, you will have pen and paper in the exam as well, so you can make notes and do it that way as well. But yeah, for an exam question, you just need to put in the amount. All good, excellent. Okay. So finally, we're going to come on to our overhead and absorption costing. And I think this can be one of the sticking points with this unit. And what you learn now on this does follow through into level three when you get onto the maths unit. So I think if you can really get a good understanding of this at this point now, it's really going to help if you do go on to level three, because there are further processes to build onto this at that level. Um, so this is a typical question that we might be given. So I'll go through it and then we'll kind of break it down as we go. So Pointy Limited is looking to calculate the unit cost for one of the multiple products it makes. It needs to calculate the overhead absorption rate to apply to each unit. The method it is considering are per unit, per labour hour, and per machine hour. Total factory activity for the period is forecast as follows. So we've got overheads expected to be £220,000. We're expecting to have 50,000 labour hours used during this period, 25,000 machine hours, and all of this kind of relates to an estimated 100,000 units. So what we need to do is complete the following table showing the possible overhead absorption rates that Pointy Limited could use. You should calculate your answers to two decimal places. Now, the purpose of this is all budgeted information. Okay, so this isn't actual. And what a business will do is you can work out the direct costs of what it makes, of how much it costs to make a product. Okay, so whatever that product might be that a business sells, if a business sells a chair, and you need wood and steel and plastic, to make that chair, and you're batch producing them in large quantities, you know how much materials that you need to make that one chair. That is classed as direct materials because you know what that cost is. Um, Equally, where you have any labor hours and machine hours, if you know that it takes someone, half an hour to make one of those products, or it takes a machine 20 minutes to make one of those products, then that's also a direct labor cost, because you can specifically allocate that cost to the cost of making one product. So when you have this product and you've got your direct materials and your direct labor, and for example, it costs me £70, to make this product. What you also have to factor in are all of your other costs. So, and these are your overheads, because when you have things like rent, you've got electricity, you've got gas, you've got salaries for HR staff, managers, supervisors, etc. All of those other type of costs you can think of, they're indirect because you can't allocate those costs specifically to a product, so they become indirect. If you get an electricity bill, for a month, you can't say that I spent, 14.5p per product of electricity, because you just don't have that level of analysis to be able to do that. So it becomes an overhead, it becomes an indirect cost. And what you kind of have to be able to work out is that if you've got these budgeted overheads of 220,000 here, for example, and it costs you £70 to make a product, okay, and you're selling it for £150, you make £80 per product that you sell. And it's very important to recognize that that isn't profit, and you have to kind of go away from using the terminology of profit and saying, well, for every chair I sell, I make £80 profit. It's not that you make profit on that. You just make £80, and that £80 for every chair that you sell, you have to sell enough to be able to cover all of your overheads. Okay, so what a business will do is it will apply an overhead absorption rate and add that onto the direct costs of making that unit. And that will allow you to then get to a selling price that will match a budgeted amount of sales you make in a period. So if you need to sell 1,000 chairs just to break even, just to cover your overheads, then you can kind of get the right selling price to do that. If selling 1,000 chairs in a month is unrealistic and you say can only sell half of that, then the chances are you're going to have to double your selling price to make up for that difference. So having an absorption rate allows you to kind of get a get a selling price for a product to know how much it costs to then be able to cover your total overheads. Because once your overheads are covered, then every product you sell after that then starts to generate a profit. So apologies if I've gone into a little bit of, a bit overkill on that, but I just kind of wanted to explain a little bit about the purpose of why we're doing this. And depending on the type of business that you're working with, you can generally do this on a per unit, a per labor hour, or a per machine hour basis. So when we're first working out an absorption rate, okay, we'll take the amount of overheads, which is 220,000, and that'll be the same for, for every amount, because that's, what we're looking at. And then what we do is we'll look at the activity. So if we were splitting these overheads based on the amount of units that we sell, if we're expected to sell 100,000 units, then if we divide our overheads by the amount of units we're expected to sell, that will give us an absorption rate of £2.20. So what that means is for every product you sell, you want to add £2.20 onto that selling price, because that will, if you sell enough, if you sell your 100,000, will cover your overheads. If you were basing this on a per labor hour basis, okay, in this case, there's 50,000 labor hours. If we divide our overheads by 50,000 instead, we get £4.40. So instead, what we will say there is, rather than looking at adding £2.20 based on the units that we're selling, we're going to allocate these based on the number of hours it takes to make these products, when we're looking at specifically labor hour. When we look at machine hours, okay, in this case, 25,000. If we take our 220,000 divided by 25,000, we get an absorption rate of £8.80. Okay. So the first step usually in this process is working out this absorption rate. Okay. Because that's going to filter in what we do next. So any questions on anything so far up to this point? Does it make sense how we've kind of got our absorption rate here for each method, and how we've calculated that? Oh, good, brilliant. Yeah, excellent, perfect. Because then what happens is we have our um, we have our product information. Okay, so all we've done here is work out an absorption rate based on budgeted information. Okay, in this case, Pointer Limited also have the following data that relates to making one unit of a type of product. So in terms of materials, for the one product that we're going to make, so for one unit, we need half a kilogram at £8 per kilogram. It's going to take 15 minutes to make at a rate of £18 per labour hour, and it will also go through a production process with machine hours, and it will take 12 minutes. So what we need to do is complete the following table to calculate the total unit cost for each of these three overhead absorption rates you calculated in the previous task. Calculate your answers to decimal places. Okay, So before we get to our overhead absorption rate, which is on this overheads rows here, we're going to work out the direct costs. Okay, so if we have materials which we need half a kilogram, okay, and it costs us £8 per kilogram, then our direct material cost is £4 per unit. Okay, so 0.5 kilograms times £8 gives us £4 per unit in materials. Okay, this is exactly the same for every method. Okay, because we're not we're not factoring in absorption rates until we get to this overheads row. Okay, so regardless of whether we're looking at the columns here for unit, labor hour, machine hour, whatever we're doing, we're just looking at the direct costs first. Okay, and regardless of what column that we're looking at there, it's always going to be exactly the same because that's what the materials are. That's what it costs to use materials to make that product. Then we're going to go to labour, okay, and this is where we do £18 per hour, okay. If we're doing this in a formula, okay, divide by 60 minutes because that will give you a cost per minute, and then times by the amount of minutes it takes to make it, okay. Equally, if you know that, sometimes you can look at it and see that, well, I know there's 4 lots of 15 minutes in an hour, so you could just divide it by 4, you'd get exactly the same answer. But generally, sometimes you might get some minutes which might not always be as obvious on the face value of it. So divide by 60 minutes times by the number of minutes it takes to make. And again, that's exactly the same for each one. Okay. Because then that gives us our total direct costs, which will be £4 for the materials plus £4.50 for labour, which gives us £8.50. Okay, which is exactly the same for each of those. So at this point here, has anyone got any questions? Does that all make sense so far as to how we've calculated the direct cost? No. Okay. Yeah. Oh, no questions then. Sorry, I thought you meant no, that didn't make sense. No, that's absolutely fine. Thank you. Yeah, all good. Perfect. So this is kind of like when I was saying before about, our direct costs and how much it costs to make, a product. We've got our total direct costs. So it costs 850 to make this one unit that we're referring to here. Now we need to look at how we allocate our overheads. Okay, and this is where we kind of go back to our overhead absorption rates here. Okay, because on a per unit basis, we've got an absorption rate of £2.20. Okay, so for the unit one, there's no calculation that we need to do. We literally just take our absorption rate because it's already on a per unit basis. So we allocate that as such. When it comes to labour hours, okay, so we have an absorption rate of £4.40 per labour hour. Okay, so we've got £4.40 as our absorption rate. But we know that it only takes 15 minutes to make a product. Okay, so this £4.40 is based on an hour, which effectively means in one labour hour, we're making 4 products. Okay, so what we need to do is again proportion this down to a per unit basis. So even though we're still looking at labour hour for our overhead absorption, we're still breaking this down to a total unit cost. What we should get is £1.10. Okay, which makes sense because if it's 440 for an hour and we can make 4 in an hour on a per unit basis, that's £1.10. It's a quarter of that. Same method applies for machine hours. Our overhead absorption rate is £8.80. Okay, so £8.80 divided by 60 minutes times by 12 minutes, because that's our production time taken from up above here, should give us £1.76. Okay, so for each of these different methods, we're allocating a slightly different amount of overheads. Okay, which we, in fact, I won't do that. Okay, then we can add those up. So if we take our 850, because we've already added these two together, don't make the mistake of adding the whole column. You've already added these two together to get a total direct cost. So take your total direct costs and add your overheads. That should give you 1070. 850 plus £1.10 should give you 960. And then 850 plus 176 should give you 1026. So a total unit cost there is slightly different based on each method. And what it will be down to a business to decide is which method is more appropriate. Now, some of you might be wondering why these figures are different. Okay, and there's a very important detail to look out for. Okay, because you would have come across questions where all of these columns are exactly the same. Okay, where every figure all the way down is exactly the same. You get the same overheads amount, you get the same total unit cost. And there's a reason for that. When a business only makes one product, okay, you'll always get the same calculations no matter what. Okay. It's when a business makes multiple products, and it's more, and that's kind of why we go on to doing it this way, where you have to start, where you start seeing these differences. So purposely in this scenario, I put at the top that the business makes multiple products. Okay, so if ever you see something that says a business makes multiple products, then you're going to see a difference in these boxes here. And the reason for that is different products have different amount of times, different amount of materials that it takes. So when you are kind of like proportioning that absorption rate, you end up with different rates. Because if you've got one product that takes, let's say, half an hour to make, and then you've got a second product which makes 2 hours to make, if you're looking at that on a labor hour basis, for example, it would be fairer to allocate 4 times amount of the overheads to that second product if it's taking 4 times longer to make it, because you think of all those other overheads that you've got to allocate. It kind of like is a fairer way of doing it, rather than just saying, well, we're going to make 100,000 units and that's a mixture of different products. It's a bit unfair to allocate the same amount of overheads when it takes some twice as long to make, or 4 times as long to make, or whatever it is. So that's always a key thing to look out for. What I've done in this one is going to show you where it looks exactly the same. And all I've done here is just slightly manipulate the data. So we're still going to use our same overheads here of £2.20. And we can kind of see the pattern that's happened here. Our activity has halved each time, and then our absorption rate has doubled each time. Okay, so when we've kind of factored that into how this information is given to us in the scenario, that's where we're going to see where these match up. All I've done is changed the labour to 15 minutes to 30 minutes, and then change the production time from 12 minutes to 15. Okay, everything else is still the same. This time, £2.20 taken from our absorption rate per unit. For labour hour, we had £4.40. Okay, so £4.40 divided by 60 minutes times by 30 minutes equals £2.20, which matches up with our overheads for the unit. And then £8.80 is our absorption rate for machine hour. So £8.80 divided by 60 minutes times 15 minutes this time also gives us £2.20. Okay, so for each of these ones, and this is where making one unit of one product, okay, we'll get the same amount. And sometimes that might have been, you might have seen that in some questions, and you kind of look at this and you think, well, what's the point? Like you can almost like fall into that trap of thinking, well, if I just do it once here, I can just copy it for those there. Sometimes that will work, sometimes it won't. So I'd always follow the process throughout, just to make sure that you're actually getting the right figures there. Okay, but the reason being, if a business makes one type of product only, it will always be the same. If they make multiple products, these will always be different. And sometimes you get a little bit of a clue in the question to that. So has anyone got any questions on that? Does that kind of make sense when we see the differences there? Um, any anyone unsure about how that works? Everyone okay with that? All good. Excellent. And sometimes you might not have to answer for all three. Sometimes it might only give you unit and machine hour, for example, and you just have to do the two rather than three. It's exactly the same process throughout. Just make sure, like I say, just follow these calculations to make sure that you actually get the right amount. I, we won't be able to download it, but these slides I've already sent to our team, and I think off the back of this, they're going to send a recording of the session along with the slides to you, so you've always got this to look back on. So hopefully that helps. And that kind of covers everything for tonight. They were the three areas that I really wanted to talk about, just because they're the ones that tend to come up the most from my experience, from working with hundreds and thousands of students. There is just a page on screen there if you are interested in any of our question banks. We do have a question bank for every unit that we do across level 2, 3, and 4. And they have all sorts of questions in there on each unit, on each topic within each unit, and then they have a mock exam in the back there as well. So if that's ever something that anyone's interested in, you can get that straight from our website. But yeah, if everyone's happy with with everything we've gone through today, then yeah, I'm happy to call it there. Just want to say a massive thank you for joining. We are, like I said at the start, we are running these sessions every couple of weeks, and we're starting with levels 2 and 3. So there'll be another level 2 one next month for business environment, I think it is. And these are going to be running to all the way to August. So yeah, if ever you're interested in any more, they're all free, so feel free to drop on. Good luck, Daisy. Fingers crossed it all goes okay, and hopefully that tonight has helped. Like I said, we'll send these resources out, and then you can always have something to look back on. There'll be a second document that's got my notes on with some workings on there as well, so you can use those too. For our support resources, for the question banks, that is fairly relative throughout all levels. We do also sell the study texts as well, which cover the whole unit. And there's usually broken down into chapters, and there's really dipping into the details within each topic. We've got more examples in there, more activities, and another mock exam in those study books as well. I think you can purchase them individually on our website as well. So if ever you're interested in those two, then that's they're available. If you're already a student with Training Link, then they're the ones that you've already got that come with the course package. So yeah, but the question banks are extra if ever that's anything anyone's interested in. Perfect. Excellent. Well, take care, everyone. Thanks for joining. Hopefully see you soon. And yeah, see you on the next one, hopefully. Take care for now. And good luck with all your exams. Fingers crossed. I hope it all goes well.